the cloud server. Okay, so it's a real pleasure and privilege to have Jill Purce with us this evening from London. You can see she has this beautiful statue of Kuan Yin behind her. And Jill is best known, obviously for her work on healing voice. But she's done a great deal of work on healing ancestral patterns and gives workshops. Certainly one of them, Jill, is around All Souls Day. You probably got one coming up around that time. And so her knowledge of this field is very, very deep and extensive. And I think what she has to say will resonate with all of us. And I'll just hand over to you at this point and ask you all to mute, if you would, so that there's no disturbances, clanking cups and glasses during the talk.
Thank you, David. Well, I've been working with healing the family and ancestors for about 25 years now. And it started from my voice work when I discovered that I started doing ceremonies to honor the ancestors. So I would go back through the male and female lines, just the direct lines, and have people, I created a kind of ceremony where we went back through these lines and honored them, these ancestors going back to the first blob. And what I found was absolute miraculous changes in people's lives. And so I started to go much more deeply into working with family constellations. And when I was doing this in the early 80s, and I was giving a workshop in Munich, and the organizer said to me, did I know the work of Bert Hellinger, because the work I was doing was so similar. And I didn't at the time, but later came to know him very well, because he actually used my husband Rupert Sheldrake's theory to explain scientifically the field, the ancestral and family field. So I got to know him very well, and he would always come and have dinner with us. But the work that I do didn't originate with him, but grew up in parallel, really, although I have worked with him. So I just wanted to say, first of all, that the ancestors have a kind of job to do, which is to help the living remain alive. And but they have no agency. They can't actually be anything but a nuisance to us until we activate the connection. So in other words, they're like clamorous children trying to get our attention, causing considerable inconveniences until we realize what they're up to. And then if you think about the ceremonies of the remembrance in the war remembrance ceremonies, we say societally, we say we will remember you. So we know societally, which means at the sort of lowest common denominator in a way, we know that the dead, and so first of all, to be an ancestor, you have to be dead. So we know that the dead need to be, and need is a very important word, need to be remembered. We know that, we will remember you. We say those words, we will remember you. And as soon as we start to do that, as soon as we start to remember and to honor the ancestor, everything in our lives change, because we are the sort of living intersection that we can actually make contact with them, although they, as I say, can only be an inconvenience to us until we activate their ability to be to have agency. And then they can do what they are considered to do in every generation, in every culture, which is to help the living remain alive. And it's very interesting. One of the things that is less known about the tsunami is that the ancestors were orphaned. The Japanese and 2011 tsunami, where a lot of the living were I don't know, 20,000 people died or something. I forget the exact figures, but this meant that the ancestors were orphaned. They didn't have. So let me just backtrack slightly. So in almost all Oriental countries, in China and Japan and in Far East, The idea of making contact with the ancestors is very, very ancient and goes back to, the beginnings of feng shui, which was about where you buried the dead and where in the landscape you buried the dead, what to do with the ridges of the mountains and the flows of the rivers and tigers and dragons and so forth. And this was essential for the well-being of the subsequent generations. So this is how feng shui began, about how you honored and buried the dead. And still in China, they have grave sweeping day on, I think it's the 6th of April. Even now in communist China, it's still very, very important. And so in the Far East, honoring the ancestors is completely essential. It's although, when I was in Japan in sort of 82, there I was staying in a family and right at the very heart of the house was the ancestral altar. And of course it was patriarchal, so it was the male family altar. What was put, it was the last male ancestor, the last head of the family. And so what was on the altar was fresh rice was made every day for them, the alcohol and so forth, and all the ancestral tablets, of course, and all the things that they liked were put on the altar. So there's a very interesting story about the tsunami, and there's a book actually about it. There was an article in the Times Literary, I forget where it was. Anyway, the person who did it then wrote a book called The Ghost of the Tsunami, and this was really about these ancestors who no longer had the living to look after, and it was found that there were that many of the priests, the Buddhist priests, found these young people in general who were inhabited by the ancestors, and they needed really to be released. They needed to be exorcised in a way, because here these ancestors with no one to look after, who occupied whoever was around. And anyway, that's a very interesting book, The Ghosts of the Tsunami. So what's very interesting, and I believe from what from the brief summary I read about last week, the person was talking about Schutzenberger. She was particularly famous for working with with anniversary syndrome, which is when things happen on the same day in subsequent generations, but also talking about epigenetics. And epigenetics is, as you probably know, the hot subject in the life sciences. And one of the leaders in this is a woman, and a woman born in Poland who emigrated to and now lives and is a professor in Israel, called Eva Jablonka. And she wrote a book in 95 and then another one in 2000, where she brought everybody's attention to these social traumas. So there were a lot of studies done about the descendants of people who were in the famines in Sweden and in Holland, the hunger winter in 44, 45, and then in Sweden, and then the displacement of people in Finland to Sweden during the war, and of course the Holocaust. So all these kind of racial and societal traumas. What they found, there have been many studies which have found that children and grandchildren, and I'm not sure how far it goes, have had mental and psychological and chemical changes, which were specifically related to the famine of their ancestors, or the Holocaust, or the traumas. So, and this has led to a huge amount of work on epigenetics. In 73, I was working with Maurice Wilkins, who got the Nobel Prize for DNA, along with the more voluble and noisy Watson and Crick. He's rather less known, but anyway, I worked in his lab for a long time. And, if you mentioned the inheritance of acquired characters, then, he would pale and sort of, send you away. Because at that time, it was considered that everything was genetic, everything was in the DNA. And of course, Darwin and people knew that this wasn't the case, and now it's become the hot subject. So now we know that that things that are acquired during the lifetime are inherited. And the most famous case of that is the inheritance of fear in mice done in Atlanta, Georgia, as an experiment about 8 years ago, where mice were subjected to a very innocent smell, acetone, phenone, something like flowers or almonds, and then given an electric shock at the same time. And then they were bred in vitro, so that the children mice and actually the grandchildren mice had no contact with the parents, and the children and the grandchildren mice were both terrified of the smell, this very innocent smell. So this is really mysterious and one of the most interesting experiments that's been done. So we know that these things are inherited, and really in the work that I'm doing, which I call Healing the Family and Ancestors, it's very much about the field of the family and ancestors, and the work is about if a notional idea of a life is interrupted by early death, suicides, emigration, abortions, addiction, giving up children for adoption, injustices, family secrets, maiming, physical ailments, and psychological incarcerations, anything which interrupts the normal notional idea of an ideal life, anything which has this kind of interruptive quality, means that there is unfinished business. And this is rather like the work of the people doing work with who remember past lives, but I won't go there. But so really, if lives have been interrupted, then in earlier generations of our ancestors, in other words, then usually there's somebody in every generation who feels connected without knowing necessarily who existed or what was wrong with them or what happened to them, but they nevertheless feel that there is something in them which has to do with some past or some inherited trauma or something, and they often feel the need to heal it. And there is usually somebody in their family who feels it's their role to heal the family, and these are the people I tend to work with. And well, these things go on from generation to generation, and it's not just individual families, but it's whole cultures. In the West, we have this salvation history. We are following the story of Abraham. Abraham abandoned his father, married his sister, and then went off to the Promised Land. And it's not quite so well known that he married his sister, but he did. She was his half sister, and then headed off to the Promised Land. Was sent into Egypt because of famine, and sold his wife. Said to his wife, said to Sarah, as she was then, "It would be better for me if you say you're my sister," and then sells her to the Pharaoh, and who has his way with her. And then the plagues come and send them on the way with lots of goodies and herds and flocks and slaves and so forth. And then he does it again. When they're approaching the kingdom of Abimelech, it would be better for me if you say you're my sister, and tries to sell her to the king Abimelech, who has nothing of it, and sends them packing. So there's this notion of salvation history. Anyway, so Sarah, as you all know, is supposed to have a child who's going to inherit the Promised Land, but she's about 90 and so doesn't. And then the Egyptian serving girl has a child and is sent by Sarah, tells Abraham banish her when she is pregnant to the desert. So Abraham takes her to the desert, and then an angel comes and says, no, go back. You'll have a child who'll be wild and a hairy man who'll be at war with his brothers. That's very significant. So she goes back and has Ishmael, and then Ishmael is 15 when she finally has a child, who's Isaac. And so Ishmael, then she says to Abraham, take Ishmael out into the desert to die so that Isaac will inherit the promised land. So she does that. He does that reluctantly. He takes Ishmael and the mother out into the desert to die, and leaves them there with a skin of water and a pita bread, and goes home. And meanwhile, a spring comes up, the Zamzam spring, and this becomes Mecca. And Ishmael, the rejected firstborn, becomes the head of the Muslims, and Isaac becomes head of the Jews, who've been at war for 4,000 years. So these what I'm trying to say by this is that these patterns go on. They're not just family patterns, but they're racial patterns as well. And that story of Abraham is the one that we in the West are following, the idea of development, evolution, going from here to there, language development, past, present, and future. you know, the whole idea that we're evolving upwards and onwards and everything's getting better, although we know it's actually getting worse, but that's another story. So what I'm trying to say by that is that it's not just individual. These are big stories, which, you know, these fields are huge, and it's as if there's a compulsion, which means that we cannot but avoid being involved in these inherited stories. So it's the opportunity, it's the curse and the blessing. So those who feel the sort of curse of it, you know, those who feel that they are inheriting something from their ancestors, are the ones who are moved to heal it. And this is what I do with these workshops, using family constellations. And the work is really about the integrity of the field. So, you know, if somebody has been an abuser in a family, for example, the temptation is to cut yourself off from that person, to banish them to outer darkness, have nothing to do with them, and then you'll be okay. But actually, the reverse is the case. If you do that, you feel guilty and you punish yourself. That person is not in their rightful place. So in this work, what I usually have people do is honor these people. And sometimes it takes people quite a long time, you know, to honor somebody who's abused them. But if you can bring yourself to do that, the work it's extraordinary, because these are the people you most want to no longer be dodgy. You know, these ancestors, these powerful ancestors. People say to me, what about my aunt? You know, she was horrible. Why would I want to honor her? But she's exactly the person you'd want to honor, because she's very powerful. So these powerful ancestors who, when they were alive, may not have been up to much, they're exactly the ones that you want to allow to come back and take their rightful place. So they're not out in outer darkness. They're not causing problems for you, because it's about an induction of order into the field. And it's not until everyone has their rightful place within the field, meaning the ancestors, and the family members, of course, that everybody feels good. And that's the essential thing, is that everybody has to feel good. And the other thing about this work is that there's no judgment, you know, because if you judge somebody and say, you know, you were a bad person, you did this, then again, it's hopeless. You can't do that. You have to work with what is without any kind of judgment at all. So these are really the main elements, which I don't know what the time is, whether that's about enough for now to generate questions and a discussion. Oh, yeah.
Jill,
Yeah.
thank you so much. I'm just going to stop recording now, and so we can have our discussion. Stop.